Sometimes you need to see through mess in order to see potential. That's our topic for today, seeing through mess to see potential. Anyone who's done any serious renovations to their house, whether it's kitchens or bathrooms or bigger, will know that there's a lot of mess that comes before you get the finished product. Our very first flat was a bit of a fixer-upper. We moved into a two-bedroom ex-council house in Whitsun, in kind of Ballgreen and kind of Stenhouse area in Edinburgh, and it was our very first flat, and we put every penny we possibly had into this property, and it was a miracle that we even got on the property market, because it was right at the height before the crash in 2007, 2008, and there were people with briefcases we were competing with, briefcases full of money showing up at flats to buy them for buy-to-lets. And this was our competition as two kind of newlyweds trying to find accommodation. But anyway, we found this flat, and it was a little bit of a fixer-upper. We saw the potential, let's just say. It had a wet room as the bathroom. And when I say wet room, I don't mean the nice kind of stylish wet room with a nice glass door and like nice tiles. I mean like a swimming pool, changing room kind of feel that, and the previous owners had needed it for accessibility, but this bathroom was not nice. And it's amazing because when you move in, you're like, we're going to change that straight away. Like 2-3 years later, we're still living with this bathroom. But eventually we decide, right, we need to do something with this bathroom. And so we saved up and we found this man who was a very good man to come and fit out our bathroom. And I still remember the process because we had to move out because it was the only bathroom in the flat. So we had to move out while he was working. And I think it took about a week to do most of it. But I remember walking in one day and in terms of demolition, he had literally taken this, not a massive bathroom, a small bathroom, right back to the brickwork and the floor joists. So like it was like you would walk in and you could fall down into the foundations. We were ground floor, and you could see all the rubble that had been there for the last 100 years or whatever. And so he would strip right back, and it was like, oh my goodness, he's really taken it back. And then he rebuilt it, and it was fantastic. We were really happy with the bathroom, and after many years, we were like, yay! It was a lovely final result. But it went through a lot of mess to get there. And when you walked in halfway through, you thought, oh my goodness, what have we done? But there was more than that because, and we probably should have got him to fix this while he was there, but it would have involved pulling the floor up in our hallway, so we decided not to, because the isolator switch and fuse box for the electric shower was an add-on. And this is an old 1930s concrete building, and so running cables around it are not easy. So they just decided to stick this big ugly box just outside the bathroom with a big isolator switch. And we were like, oh, this is so frustrating. We should really have got that fixed at the same time, but we didn't. And so a while later, we were like, what are we going to do? We should pay someone to come in and fix this. And so a friend of ours who was a very handy guy who could kind of turn his hand to anything said, I'll do that for you. That'll be an easy job. And so we signed him up, and his name was Mike, and we said, come along, Mike, and he was like, it'll be easy, we'll just make a channel in the wall down here, and we'll put the cables in here, and we'll rewire it, and we'll put the fuse back up in the normal fuse box where it should be, and we'll get all that working. And so that was the plan. I remember the first day I let him in, and then I went off to work, and I came back, and I pushed the door open, and a cloud of dust just billowed out of the door. And I need to describe Mike for you, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what he looks like. He's got long, curly brown hair, quite long and slightly bedraggled. At the time, had a massive big beard. And he's standing there with goggles on, a face mask on, and white from head to toe. And I'm pretty sure one of the first or second things he said to me is, Joe coming back soon? Because he understood what I was looking into. I stood there for silence for a minute because the entire flat was filled with dust. He'd taken some sort of hammer to the wall, and it was just concrete, so it was just like, so there were big holes down the wall. There was dust on everything in the entire place. The thing was a complete disaster. And for the next half an hour to an hour, Mike and I scurried around furiously trying to tidy it before Joe got home from work. And I had to call Joe and say, just so you know, okay, it might be a little bit messy before it gets better. We did eventually manage to get it, but it was one of those funny moments where it was like absolute disaster. I think it took months to actually get the plaster dust because it was like wiping TVs every 2 minutes to get the thing. But good things came from the end of it. We did get the fuse box moved. And so sometimes there's mess in a process, and we need to be prepared to put up with the mess in order to get to the end result. Good things come with mess, and often we have to see through the mess in order to see what God is doing. Now, last week and this week, we're looking at kind of parables of Jesus. And as I described last week, often the parables are designed to be simple to remember stories that help us change our worldview. Jesus is telling stories that help us to see the world differently. He's almost painting a picture and saying, this is what reality is like. And if you pay attention to the parables, you get a better sense of how God works. So last week, we talked about how can we see God in our circumstances. And last week, we looked at the idea of smallness. We looked at the mustard seed and how actually when God moves, we don't want to discount the small things. We need to be prepared to see the seeds, not just the fully grown plants. Not despising the days of small beginnings, as it says in the Bible. And so this week I want to explore it through another parable, which is going to help us see how when God moves, sometimes it's messy. Surely not, you say. Well, surely when God moves, when God does something in our world, it's going to be neat and tidy and easy to understand. And there's going to be no mess in it at all, is there? Well, we're going to look today at the parable of what's called the wheat and the weeds, or the wheat and the tares, depending on your translation. And we're in Matthew chapter 13, if you want to follow along. And it's going to be on the screen as well. We've got Matthew 13, starting at verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with it. Let them grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." So again, like last week, the kingdom of heaven is kind of made to look like a seed. Remember, Jesus is speaking into this agricultural age. My knowledge of agriculture comes from Clarkson's Farm, which have just started the new series, which is great fun. So I'm not an expert on agriculture. But Jesus is using these metaphors of agriculture from because that's what would have spoken to the day. I kind of wonder sometimes, what would he use today? Would he be talking about iPhones and computers? I don't know. But he used something that would help people understand it in their day. And what happens again in this story is that this seed, this very small thing, is buried in the ground, ready to produce a good harvest of wheat. And when they're not paying attention, an enemy comes and sows weeds in the field. This happens unnoticed, unseen, and then we don't know until things start to grow. Perhaps it's that the weeds blend in alongside the crops and you can't quite initially tell, but eventually it becomes clear that the whole field is a bit of a mess. Where did all the weeds come from? And the servants are keen to deal with this, because if you think about it, the servants are probably the ones that planted the crops, and this is going to look bad for them. This looks like we don't know what we're doing, okay? When you look out at the field and you're like, okay, this is a disaster. And so the master says, no, we're not going to pull up the weeds, because there's a good chance the kind of roots have become intertwined. If we pull up the weeds, we're going to also pull up the crops. The crops are not ready to be harvested, and so there's we're going to have to play the waiting game until the harvest is ready, and then we'll pull the weeds, and then we'll get the crops. That's kind of the plan. Now, we could jump to all sorts of our own ideas about what this parable means, but this is one of the parables where the disciples go ahead of us and say, "What on earth are you talking about, Jesus? Aren't you thankful for the disciples?" They say, "What are you talking about, Jesus?" And he actually explains this one. So if you look ahead to verse 37, you'll find where Jesus explains. He answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out his kingdom, everything that causes sin and all who do evil. Then they will throw them into a blazing furnace, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear." So Jesus is sowing seed, and he sows this good seed into the field. And these are the people who are seeking God's kingdom. But there are people who are aligned with the enemy, who are seeking to bring disruption, and that is the weeds that are planted. At the end of the age, Jesus is going to return, and he's going to sort out between the weeds and the crops. But that's not going to happen until the very end. Now, this parable is striking, and Jesus' kind of description of what happens is very striking and challenging to our modern ears, because it puts the emphasis back on the judgment of God, which is a reality that we believe in, that where one day God will actually judge the world. And it's not a popular or easy message in our culture, but it is one that comes in and through Jesus' ministry again and again. Until that final harvest, we live in that in-between period where you've got both the wheat and the weeds growing up alongside each other. In other words, it's messy. And like the servants, perhaps we long for a time for it just to get in there and sort it out. To sort things out and to make things a little bit less messy. But the reality is when we look around our world, we see that mess. We see the good things, the beautiful things, we see the righteous things, but we also see tainted things and broken things and painful things. And we see it in ourselves. We see our mixed motives and our selfish desires. We see people of great character who make awful mistakes. We see people of poor character who win great success. We see wars and genocide and hunger. But we also see peacemakers and humanitarian aid organizations and food banks and homeless shelters. We see a field full of both wheat and weeds. And most of us, we long for, like the servants, to get it sorted now. God, would you sort it out now? But the message Jesus gives us in this parable is, trust me, there is a future justice coming. But the in-between time is messy. So this parable gives us a different worldview that we need to put the right kind of glasses on to be able to see the world through this lens. And so what is our main point for today? Our main point for today is simply expect a mess. Expect a mess. You see, when God moves, it's messy. So if you want to see what God is doing, you need to be prepared for mess. In this age that we live in, this in-between time, there is very little that is 100% pure. And we shouldn't expect that. Sometimes people discount what God is doing because it's messy. We all struggle with mess. We like things nice and neat and tidy and tied up with a bow. We like to try and tame and understand the untamable God. And we put ourselves often, if we're honest, as judge, and we say, if it was God, surely it wouldn't be so messy. And of course, we're praying for God to move powerfully in our midst. And the truth is that if God answers that prayer in the way that our hearts desire, it will be messy. If God was to come and do all the things that we dream that he would do in our church, in our communities, in our region, let me tell you now, it wouldn't be neat and tidy. I expect there would be amazing God moments. There would be people coming to salvation, dreams, visions, and miracles happening across our region. A sense of God's presence running throughout everything. I'd expect holy awe, and I'd expect answered prayers and bold preaching. But I'd also expect a lot of criticism. People falling out with each other left, right, and center. Strange things that we cannot explain. People labeling things of God as the devil. I'd expect people to be exaggerating things, and I'd be expecting people to try and make money out of the process. Now, that doesn't sound very encouraging, does it? But that is the worldview that Jesus gives us in this parable. The wheat and the weeds are growing up in the same field. Have you read the stories of God moving in the Bible? When Jesus walked on the earth, it was not all peace and tranquility. He himself said in Matthew 10, "Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death," as a result of his ministry. This is the good news that Jesus came to bring us. That actually when Jesus moves, it's divisive. It causes difficult things to happen. And eyes that are ready to see what God does are eyes that expect it to be a little bit messy. And I think it's captured throughout the New Testament. We have like Paul and Mark falling out. We have church members thinking it's okay to sleep around with family members. It's all in the book. And I love the Bible because it doesn't pretend like difficult things aren't happening. It actually just writes them in the pages. People mess up. People are human. There's no 100% pure move of God that is not tainted in this age. And often in situations where God is moving powerfully, we get ourselves into all sorts of traps going, is this God or is this man? And the most honest answer is yes. Is this God or is this man? Yes. Because God tends to move through people. That's the way he operates. Of course, there are times where he sovereignly does things, but the majority, normative way God moves is through broken people like you and me. Is it God or is it man? Yes. And often when we look historically, we have certain, obviously, in the Bible we have people we look to as heroes of the faith. Most of them have got some pretty bad baggage as well. And it's true historically. And unfortunately with historical things, we tend to edit out some of the bits we don't like. And different parts of the church approach this very differently. So you've got obviously famous people like John Wesley, who began the Methodist movement. And when people kind of look at him as a hero of the faith, they often look at the great preaching he did. So he rode around the whole of the UK on a horseback, preaching in fields and speaking the word of God to tens of thousands, seeing them saved. And that's what we like, isn't it? That good, solid Bible preacher who went round valuing the Bible. But most of the people fail to mention how chaotic and messy his meetings actually were. Or the fact that he actually was kicked, like the church did not accept John Wesley. The reason he was preaching in fields is because the church wouldn't have him. And it wasn't because of his heart. He wanted to be part of the church, but they kicked him out. And that's what created this mass movement in the fields. And some of his meetings were just bizarre. You had people screaming out in the middle of meetings in fields. You had people who were so overcome by the presence of God, they fell out of trees. And I imagine just because it was God, it still hurt. Like, imagine it was chaotic and it was messy, but it was God. It was messy and it was glorious. The wheat and the weeds are growing in the same field. If we want to have eyes to see what God is doing, we need to be able to recognize that as reality. We need to learn how to honor what God is doing without stumbling over what he's not doing. And that applies both in smallness, looking at the small things, but also in messy things. Now, it's important you hear what I'm not. That we should just be okay and all mess and dysfunction and ugliness is all okay. Of course, we should, as the people of God, continue to strive for holiness, to be godly in our attitudes, to be unified, to resist pride and various other traps that we can fall into. I'm not saying we should be okay with mess. I'm just saying It's part of it. It's part of life in this age. And just because something's messy doesn't mean it's not God. In fact, you could even say the fact it's messy often reveals God is at work, because he works despite our failings. God doesn't wait for you and I to become perfect in order to move. Thank goodness. He'd be waiting a long time. Paul puts this in 2 Corinthians 4. He says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay." And he says this interesting. He says that this all-surpassing power, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. In other words, we have, God moves through this earthen vessel, this jars of clay, these ordinary ways. And by doing it through broken, ordinary, failing people, he actually displays that this is God. So sometimes mess can be a sign it's God. Can we honor what God is doing without stumbling over what he's not doing? I'm always reminded of poor John the Baptist. I think John the Baptist had a hard time in lots of different ways, not least getting his head chopped off. But, it was an awkward upbringing. It was in the desert on his own with eating locusts and honey and, bizarre diet. But we read this in Matthew 11. We'll put it on the screen. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" This is fascinating. So just to give you the context, John has been put in prison here for saying nasty things about Herod and his relationship with family members and all sorts of things. So he's been put in prison. And previously, we've already read that John has declared Jesus is the Messiah. He stood and baptized him and said, "This is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." But here we have John in prison. And he's human. He's in prison and he's starting to think, this doesn't look how I expected. If my cousin is really the Messiah, surely I shouldn't be in prison. So he's in prison and his circumstances are having this effect on him. And he asks, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replies in verse 4, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor." And in verse 6, "Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." This is a difficult moment for John, and Jesus' reply is really interesting. He's not harsh. He doesn't belittle the doubts that John has in prison. He simply says, "Look at what I am doing." Now, for John, he could list quite easily all the things Jesus was not doing, and top of his list was freeing him from prison, because the Messiah was supposed to set the captives free. That's actually one of the things that they were expecting to happen. But Jesus doesn't harshly rebuke him. He just says, "Focus your eyes on what I am doing. Look at the activity I'm doing." In other words, take your eyes off the weeds and look at the wheat. And he says this, "Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." What a line that is. Now, we all stumble for lots of different reasons in our life. We all make mistakes. We all trip over things. We all get distracted. But Jesus is saying that one of the things we can stumble over is him. We can actually stumble over Jesus. And he's saying here, blessed or happy or kind of well is the person who doesn't stumble over what Jesus is not doing. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes from our perspective, Jesus is not doing what we want him to do. Anyone else agree with that? Sometimes Jesus is just simply not doing what I want him to do. He's not very obedient like that, is he? Doesn't do what I want. But sometimes it's just that he's not doing it the way that I want him to do it. God, if you're going to do it, could you at least do it the way I would like you to do it? That would be great, thanks. But sometimes it just looks messy. We're longing for that field that has nothing but wheat. But everywhere we look, we're seeing weeds. And one day that will be completely true. The reason we have that longing at all is because it's reality. There will be a day where the crops come in, when God deals with the weeds. But I find Jesus' words quite haunting. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. So I think this parable today gives us a lens, a way in which we're called to see the world. That we should not be surprised when we look around and we see a mixed story. We see the gloriousness of God. We see the goodness, the beauty, the truth. And we also see the mess, the ugliness, the pain. If last week we talked about seeing God in the little ways, the small ways, this week I'm asking us, would we see God even in the mess? I believe when God moves powerfully in our church, in our region, it's going to be messy. And we need to not have an idealistic view of life. We need to have a realistic view of what it looks like when God moves. Because and all of these things are found in the Bible. This is what I love about it. Like I say, it's radically honest. Sometimes it looks like you're sitting with sickness while God heals the person next to you. Or perhaps even worse than that, God uses you to heal someone while you're sick. Sometimes it looks like the people of God that you think are brothers and sisters resisting what God is doing in your life and fighting against it. Sometimes it looks like your family not understanding you or understanding your pursuit of God. Sometimes it looks like leaders going off on one. Sometimes it looks like people turning moves of God into political gain. But I find in the picture of Jesus coming to dwell amongst us something amazing. Because sometimes it looks like a tiny, vulnerable infant in a dirty, smelly, unsanitary feeding trough. Sometimes that's the move of God. It's messy, unpleasant, vulnerable, but it's God. And that talk of stables reminds me of this great proverb, which I think summarizes it. I've got two translations up for you here. Proverbs 14:4. Without oxen, a stable stays clean, but you need a strong ox for a large harvest. Or in the New King James, where no oxen are, the trough is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox. This proverb is basically saying, you can either have it nice and neat and tidy, or you can get some stuff done. If you're going to have ox in your stable, you can expect there to be some, you know what. And I think that's the reality that I'm trying to paint for us today, is that if we really long for the stuff of God to happen, we need the ox in the stable. We need the strength of the Lord to work in our midst, but we should expect a mess. The wheat and the weed are growing in the same field. That's the basic message I want to leave you with today. So I want to invite the band, if you guys want to come up and get yourselves ready. We're going to worship in a minute, and I just want to pray for us. God, I thank you for just the radical honesty that we find in the Bible, that it's not an airbrushed reality. That when we look at your words, we find truth. And in this season, we find that truth looks like the good and the bad alongside. The wheat and the weeds. And God, we do long. We long to see the weeds, the things that stand against your kingdom, taken away. And we know that one day they will be. But until then, we pray, God, that you would give us eyes to see you in the mess. That when we look at the feeding trough with the tiny baby, we see the work of God. When we look into the circumstances of you moving, we see and are not stumbling because of what you're not doing. And I pray you'd give us the kind of eyes that can see you, even when it's not neat and tidy. And I pray you'd prepare our hearts in humility to come to you and say, show us what you're doing in this time, God. Show us what you're doing in these days, God. Let's just take a moment just in quiet. We're going to worship in a minute, but just take a moment with the Lord. And if there's anything he wants to show you, just be listening.